Imagine this. It's Derby Day, 1927. The air is rich with cigar smoke, the rustle of silk gowns, and the gleam of polished silver. At the heart of the celebration stands the grand Vanderbilt estate, where America's elite gather to toast champagne, place bets, and indulge in something truly unforgettable, the feast. But this wasn't just any spread. This was a symphony of forgotten luxury, oysters bubbling in anise-scented cream, sweetbreads draped in truffle jus, delicate charlottes resting in cut crystal goblets. Each dish, a masterpiece. Each bite, a statement of power and prestige. Yet somehow, these recipes vanished. Lost to time, buried beneath decades of convenience and change. Until now. Today, we unlock the doors to this hidden culinary past and step inside a world of gilded tablecloths and handcrafted elegance. These are 15 forgotten high-class American family recipes, once served to aristocrats, now revived for a new generation. Let's take a seat at the Vanderbilt Derby Day table and discover what the upper crust was really eating in 1927. They weren't just a dish. They were a declaration. At the 1927 Vanderbilt Derby Day spread, oysters a la Rockefeller weren't served, they were presented. Gilded silver platters cradled rows of glistening oysters, bubbling beneath a vivid green sauce so luxurious, it shimmered like emerald velvet. But behind the elegance lies a story of culinary genius and secrecy. This dish was first created in 1899 at Antoine's, the oldest French Creole restaurant in New Orleans. The goal? To craft an oyster dish so rich, so indulgent, that it could only be named after the wealthiest man in America, John D. Rockefeller. And it lived up to that name. The original recipe? Still a closely guarded secret. But what we do know is this: fresh oysters on the half shell, topped with a sauce of butter, herbs, breadcrumbs, and absinthe or Pernod, then broiled to a golden sizzle. Some versions included spinach or parsley, giving the dish that legendary green hue, though purists argue that the exact herb blend remains an enigma. In 1927, at the height of the Gatsby era, oysters a la Rockefeller symbolized something more than just taste. They represented exclusivity. A way for hosts like the Vanderbilts to say, yes, we can afford this. Not just the oysters, but the ceremony, the shucking, the baking, the delicate silver servers designed specifically for this one dish. Today, oysters a la Rockefeller are rarely seen outside of vintage menus or forgotten cookbooks. Yet their legacy survives, echoes of green decadence and coastal indulgence from an era where presentation was everything. One taste, and you're not just eating seafood. You're tasting history, luxury, and a time when American cuisine flirted unapologetically with opulence. It's easy to overlook celery today, just a crunchy sidekick on a veggie tray. But in 1927, at the Vanderbilt Derby Day table, Celery Victor stood tall, elegant, refined, and worthy of center stage. This dish was a darling of the early 20th century fine dining scene, born not in a home kitchen, but in the grand dining room of San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel. Created by French chef Victor Hertzler, it reimagined celery from a humble stockpot ingredient into a high society appetizer. Here's how it was done. Whole hearts of celery, carefully selected for tenderness, were blanched until just crisp tender, then marinated in a delicate, chilled broth laced with white wine vinegar, olive oil, peppercorns, and a whisper of tarragon essence. The key? Letting the flavors marry overnight, until the celery absorbed every aromatic note. Served cold, plated with precision, and often garnished with watercress or shaved ice, Celery Victor was the culinary equivalent of Art Deco, sleek, minimal, yet full of detail. And on Derby Day at the Vanderbilt estate, this wasn't a throwaway dish. It was a palate cleanser, a conversation starter, a nod to the sophistication of West Coast cuisine making its mark on the East. Guests raised their brows not in doubt, but in respect, because here was celery, reborn into something noble. Today, this dish is a ghost, rarely spotted, even in vintage French cookbooks. But in its prime, it represented a moment in American culinary history where restraint was the luxury, and simplicity, when done flawlessly, was more impressive than extravagance. Celery Victor reminds us, Sometimes the most powerful flavor isn't bold, it's intentional. At first glance, they looked like tiny jewels, perched delicately on silver trays, nestled between crystal goblets and monogrammed napkins. But these weren't just hors d'oeuvres. On the 1927 Vanderbilt Derby Day table, deviled quail eggs on toast points were a symbol of precision, privilege, and the art of fine detail. While deviled eggs had long been a staple of American Southern gatherings, this version elevated the concept to aristocratic levels. Quail eggs, much smaller, rarer, and more difficult to peel, were favored for their novelty and refinement. Just preparing them required patience and a steady hand. Each egg was carefully hard-boiled, sliced, and filled with a rich, velvety yolk mixture whipped with Dijon mustard, cream, cayenne pepper, and minced capers. The flavors were sharp, complex, and unapologetically bold, echoing the jazz and champagne energy of the era. But the base was just as important. These weren't served on platters or plates. Each egg sat atop a buttered toast point, cut from the finest white loaf, trimmed, toasted to a golden crunch, and sometimes brushed with a whisper of anchovy or truffle oil. The contrast, soft egg, creamy yolk, and crisp toast, was orchestrated to perfection. At the Vanderbilt gathering, they were passed around by gloved servers, often with chilled sherry or sparkling wine, and always with a sense of spectacle. Guests admired them before tasting. And when they did, just a bite or two, it was enough to leave an impression. Today, these tiny bites are nearly extinct, pushed aside by modern convenience. But back then, they spoke volumes. They said, "We don't cut corners. We celebrate detail. And nothing on this table is ordinary." Deviled quail eggs on toast points, a forgotten taste of meticulous elegance, once reserved for the elite. It arrived at the Vanderbilt Derby Day feast like a cool breath of refinement, served in delicate porcelain bowls, crowned with a swirl of chive-infused cream, and chilled to perfection. This was vichyssoise, but not just any version. This was a soup that whispered luxury in every spoonful. Though it sounds French, and indeed, it draws inspiration from French peasant fare, vichyssoise is a proudly American invention. It was created in 1917 by Chef Louis Diet at the Ritz-Carlton in New York. Remembering the simple leek and potato soups of his childhood in Vichy, France, Diet added an American twist. He served it cold. The result? A sensation. By 1927, it had become a favorite among high society. And at the Vanderbilt estate, it served a key role, a cooling, elegant first course that cleansed the palate while setting the tone for the grandeur to follow. The recipe was deceptively simple, but the execution? Flawless. Silky Yukon Gold potatoes and leeks were simmered in chicken stock, strained to absolute smoothness, and enriched with heavy cream. Then came the chilling, an overnight rest that allowed the flavors to deepen and marry. Just before serving, a swirl of whipped chive cream was added to the top, like an artist's flourish. Each bite was cold and velvety, with an undertone of sweetness from the leeks and a grassy brightness from the chives. No spice, no clutter, just purity, balance, and elegance. Today, cold soup is rare. And vichyssoise, once a culinary trendsetter, has faded into obscurity. But in its heyday, it was more than soup. It was a statement of modern sophistication, a dish that demanded you pause, savor, and appreciate restraint. Vichyssoise wasn't made to impress. It was made to elevate, quietly, gracefully, and completely. In a world where roast chicken was common fare, braised squab was something else entirely, a bird for the elite, small in stature but mighty in flavor. At the 1927 Vanderbilt Derby Day feast, braised squab in Madeira wine sauce was the centerpiece for those who understood indulgence without overstatement. It didn't scream for attention. It whispered wealth. Squab, young domestic pigeon, was considered one of the most refined meats of the era. Its flesh was tender, dark, and slightly gamey, often compared to duck, but even more delicate. It was the kind of dish that required precision, patience, and presentation. The preparation began with a slow sear, locking in flavor, before the birds were gently braised in a Madeira wine reduction, a heady, amber-colored sauce made from veal stock, shallots, and the fortified Portuguese wine that lent both sweetness and complexity. The sauce was reduced slowly until every drop clung like velvet to the squab. Just before serving, the dish was finished with a pat of butter and a dash of cracked black pepper, giving the entire plate a gleaming, almost lacquered appearance. Served atop toasted brioche or a nest of Duchess potatoes, this was food as performance, not just a main course, but a showpiece. At the Vanderbilt table, it was usually paired with a bold red Bordeaux or a dark sherry, reinforcing its old-world pedigree. Today, squab has all but vanished from mainstream American menus. But in 1927, it was a subtle way for hosts to say, "We have access to what others don't." Braised squab in Madeira wine sauce wasn't about feeding the body. It was about satisfying the palate of the powerful, a flavor that lingered longer than the applause and deeper than any horse race finish. At the Vanderbilt Derby Day feast of 1927, grandeur wasn't just expected, it was choreographed. And no dish captured that theatrical elegance quite like the crown roast of lamb. Shaped into a regal ring, with rib bones turned upward like a crown, this wasn't just a meal, it was a culinary centerpiece. It demanded attention. It was the kind of dish that arrived at the table in silence, broken only by gasps of admiration. This elaborate cut of lamb was meticulously Frenched, seasoned with garlic, rosemary, and cracked pepper, then tied into its iconic circular form. Roasted slowly to a blushing medium rare, it emerged from the oven glistening, each bone tipped with a delicate paper frill, known as a chop frill, to emphasize its royal silhouette. But what made this dish sing was what accompanied it. A minted pea puree, silky and bright, offering contrast to the roast's richness. Prepared from fresh spring peas, the puree was folded with cream, butter, and finely chopped mint, a nod to both English tradition and the emerging American love for seasonal produce. In 1927, this dish symbolized more than wealth. It reflected care, craftsmanship, and a respect for visual drama. The host who served a crown roast wasn't showing off, they were demonstrating mastery. Guests would each receive a single rib chop, sliced tableside, resting on a spoonful of vibrant green puree. Every bite was balanced, herbaceous, savory, slightly sweet. A meal fit for a Derby Day gathering where image and indulgence were perfectly entwined. Today, the crown roast is a rare sight, too labor-intensive for most, too grand for casual affairs. But in its time, it was a triumph. A reminder that in great cooking, as in great society, presentation is power. Crown roast of lamb with minted pea puree, a forgotten throne of flavor from America's age of opulence. To dine at the Vanderbilt Derby Day table in 1927 was to taste the rare, the refined, and the unapologetically elite. And few dishes captured that spirit more than truffled sweetbreads with asparagus spears, a plate that whispered sophistication to those who truly understood it. Now, let's talk about sweetbreads. Not bread. And not sweet. Sweetbreads are the delicate glands of young calves or lambs, prized in French cuisine for their soft, buttery texture and subtle flavor. By the early 20th century, they had crossed the Atlantic into America's most luxurious kitchens, where they became a delicacy served to those with discerning palates. For Derby Day, these sweetbreads were treated like royalty. First, they were soaked and gently poached, then pressed to remove excess moisture. After that, each portion was dusted with flour, lightly pan-seared in clarified butter, and finished in a pan sauce made with veal stock, Madeira wine, and shaved black truffle, imported, of course, for no expense was spared at a Vanderbilt table. Beside them sat steamed asparagus spears, neatly aligned, drizzled with lemon-infused butter or even a touch of hollandaise. The contrast of textures, the creamy richness of the sweetbreads, the tender snap of the asparagus, was no accident. It was choreographed, like everything else that day. This wasn't just a dish, it was a quiet signal. You're not at an ordinary dinner party. You're in the presence of culinary sophistication. Today, sweetbreads have faded from popular menus, too misunderstood or labor-intensive for modern kitchens. But in the Gilded Age and through the Roaring '20s, they were a calling card of the well-traveled and well-fed. Truffled sweetbreads with asparagus spears, a forgotten emblem of refinement, once reserved for tables where elegance ruled, and only the extraordinary was allowed to shine. Few dishes at the 1927 Vanderbilt Derby Day spread could match the drama and decadence of lobster Newburg in puff pastry shells. This was not a dish meant to sit quietly on the table. It arrived steaming, golden, and dripping in indulgence. The story of lobster Newburg begins, surprisingly, with a sea captain. In the late 1800s, a wealthy sea captain named Ben Wenberg brought the recipe to Delmonico's, New York's most celebrated restaurant. A mix of lobster, butter, cognac, sherry, egg yolks, and cream, the dish was so impressive that it was added to the menu in his honor, until a falling out led to the name being altered to Newburg. But the name hardly mattered. The dish had already secured its place in American culinary royalty. By the 1920s, it had evolved again. For Derby Day, the Vanderbilts took it a step further, serving the rich lobster filling inside delicate puff pastry shells, each one golden and flaky, like edible sculpture. The contrast was intentional, soft and velvety seafood inside, crisp and airy pastry outside. The lobster, fresh from the Atlantic, was lightly sautéed in butter, then folded into a sauce thickened with egg yolks and enriched with cognac and cream. The final touch? A splash of sherry and a sprinkle of cayenne, bringing just enough heat to lift the richness. Served individually, each pastry shell became a luxurious surprise. Guests would break into it with a spoon, releasing steam and that unmistakable aroma of warm cream and sweet lobster, a sensory signal that they were tasting something truly rare. Today, lobster Newburg is nearly forgotten, overtaken by simpler fare. But for a brief, golden moment, it stood tall as one of America's most elegant inventions. Lobster Newburg in puff pastry shells, a masterpiece of excess, born from the sea but destined for the highest tables. Among the glittering glassware and silver-domed platters of the 1927 Vanderbilt Derby Day banquet, there sat something unexpectedly small, yet deeply luxurious. Stuffed tomatoes with caviar mousse. To the untrained eye, it looked simple, modest, even. But make no mistake, this was a statement piece, dressed in red and crowned in black. At a time when presentation and pedigree mattered just as much as taste, this dish was a reflection of early 20th century culinary ingenuity. It took two ingredients from opposite ends of the dining spectrum, the humble tomato and the extravagant caviar, and united them into something completely new. The tomatoes, chosen at the height of ripeness, were peeled, hollowed, and lightly salted, then chilled until firm. Their insides were replaced with a silky mousse made from whipped cream, lemon juice, strained egg whites, and just enough fine sturgeon caviar to leave an unmistakable briny richness on the tongue. Sometimes a touch of gelatin was added to help the mousse set, while chopped chives or herbs were folded in for color. Each tomato was then finished with a delicate spoonful of additional caviar placed on top, like a glossy black jewel set in edible velvet. Served on beds of crushed ice or butter lettuce, these were passed to guests during the cocktail hour, paired with dry champagne, soft music, and the quiet hum of high society. In 1927, this dish whispered elegance. It didn't shout or demand attention. Instead, it suggested, "I am rare, I am refined, and I know exactly what I'm doing." Today, the pairing of tomatoes and caviar might seem unusual. But for the upper crust of Jazz-Age America, it represented a perfect balance of restraint and extravagance. Stuffed tomatoes with caviar mousse, an edible paradox that defined an era where subtlety was the most powerful luxury of all. Not every dish at the 1927 Vanderbilt Derby Day table was cloaked in cream or laced with truffle. Some spoke in a southern drawl, quiet, proud, and unforgettable. Enter Virginia ham biscuits with red pepper jelly. Deceptively simple, this dish was a nod to Southern aristocracy, a region where hospitality and heritage were baked into every bite. And while the Vanderbilts may have been Northeastern elites, they knew that true elegance often came wrapped in tradition, and nothing was more traditional than cured ham on a homemade biscuit. But this wasn't the ham from your local market. This was aged, salt-cured Virginia ham, sliced paper-thin and glistening with flavor. Each slice had been smoked over hickory wood and aged for months, sometimes over a year, developing a deep, savory intensity unmatched by anything mass-produced. And the biscuit? Flaky, buttery, impossibly light, made from hand-sifted flour, cultured buttermilk, and a touch of lard, just like generations of Southern cooks had done before. Baked golden and split gently, they cradled the ham like fine linen holds a jewel. But what truly elevated this Derby Day delight was the red pepper jelly. Bright, sweet, and just a touch fiery, the jelly offered a bold contrast to the salty ham and buttery biscuit. Made from sweet red bell peppers, cider vinegar, and pectin, with a whisper of cayenne, it added color, flavor, and unexpected flair. Spread thinly or dolloped generously, it transformed a traditional snack into a high society revelation. Guests didn't just eat these, they remembered them. Served during afternoon cocktails or late in the evening alongside bourbon and laughter, these little sandwiches bridged the gap between familiarity and finesse. Virginia ham biscuits with red pepper jelly, a bite-sized legacy from below the Mason-Dixon line, dressed up for the finest table in America. In 1927, when the Vanderbilt estate hosted its legendary Derby Day celebration, one dish arrived with the elegance of a waltz and the flavor of high drama. Duck à l'orange with candied kumquats. This wasn't just French cuisine. It was the French cuisine that defined aristocratic dining in both Europe and America. Its roots stretch back to the royal courts of France, where roast duck paired with citrus was seen as the perfect balance of richness and refinement. By the early 20th century, the dish had crossed the Atlantic, landing squarely on the tables of America's elite. At Derby Day, it wasn't merely served. It was staged. Whole ducks were dry-aged for flavor, then roasted until the skin crackled, a deep, amber crispness sealing in the tender meat below. But the real art lay in the sauce, a reduction of orange juice, white wine vinegar, sugar, and rich duck stock, thickened just slightly and perfumed with Grand Marnier or cognac. It was glossy, bright, and vibrant, a citrus glaze that danced across the plate. And just when guests thought it couldn't get more indulgent, there were candied kumquats. Tiny, tart citrus fruits, rare and exotic even then, were poached in sugar syrup until translucent, then spooned delicately over the duck. They added both a sparkle of color and an unexpected sweetness that pushed the dish into the realm of the unforgettable. This was a showstopper, a dish that announced itself even before the first bite. The scent alone, a blend of roast, citrus, and caramel, was enough to turn heads across the table. Today, duck à l'orange has mostly vanished into memory. But paired with candied kumquats, it remains one of the finest examples of how old-world elegance met new-world ambition on America's grandest plates. At first glance, it looked like something simple. Just potatoes, thinly sliced, golden brown, arranged like petals on a plate. But in the Vanderbilt Dining Hall on Derby Day 1927, these were no ordinary potatoes. They were potatoes Anna, crowned with black truffle shavings, a quiet masterpiece of technique, tradition, and pure indulgence. The dish was born in 19th-century France, likely in the kitchens of chef Adolphe Douglera, a student of Carême, and named in honor of a Parisian courtesan. By the early 20th century, it had crossed into high society on both sides of the Atlantic, where restraint and richness existed side by side. The preparation was meticulous. Potatoes, often Yukon Gold or another waxy variety, were peeled, sliced paper-thin, and layered in concentric circles inside a copper pan brushed with clarified butter. Each layer was seasoned, then pressed gently and cooked over flame until the bottom crisped to a deep golden brown. The entire pan was then flipped, carefully, so the top could become the new crisp bottom. The result? A cake of potato, crisp on the outside, melting and buttery within. But the true twist for Derby Day? A final flourish of fresh black truffle, shaved whisper-thin and scattered over the top just before serving. Earthy, aromatic, and unmistakably luxurious, it transformed a humble French classic into something fit for Gilded Age royalty. This dish was never meant to scream. It was meant to smolder quietly at the side of a roast, or steal the show as the most elegant side on the table. It spoke of time, patience, and privilege. Today, potatoes Anna is nearly forgotten, too labor-intensive for most, too subtle for fast cuisine. But when paired with truffle, it becomes a dish that embodies deliberate elegance. Potatoes Anna with black truffle shavings, a forgotten poem written in butter and earth. Among the rich roasts, golden pastries, and truffled delights of the 1927 Vanderbilt Derby Day feast, one dish arrived like a whisper. Champagne gelée with violet petals, light, sparkling, and utterly ethereal. It was a dessert not meant to fill the stomach, but to dazzle the senses. A final note in the symphony of flavors, as elegant and fleeting as a champagne bubble. The concept of gelée, or jelly, had long been a favorite in aristocratic dining, dating back to the royal banquets of 18th century France. But by the Jazz Age, American high society gave it new life, with the addition of imported champagne and the flair of edible flowers. This particular version began with real French champagne, dry, crisp, and cold. Into it was folded a light syrup infused with lemon zest, softened gelatin sheets, and just a hint of elderflower or vanilla. The mixture was poured into crystal coupes or silver molds, then chilled until set but still shimmering with movement. Just before serving, each gelée was crowned with candied violet petals, delicate blooms preserved in sugar, their color vivid, their perfume subtle. To the eye, it looked like glass holding frozen springtime. To the palate, it was cool, floral, and just barely sweet. At the Vanderbilt estate, it was served between courses or as a light dessert, especially for the ladies of the party, those who wanted refinement without weight, indulgence without excess. It was more than a dish. It was an experience, a pause, a breath of elegance. Today, champagne gelée has all but vanished from menus, replaced by heavier sweets and simplified tastes. But in its moment, it was the embodiment of grace. Champagne gelée with violet petals, a forgotten jewel of the table, delicate as lace, bold as spring, and made to vanish the moment it touched your tongue. By the time dessert arrived at the 1927 Vanderbilt Derby Day feast, the table had already dazzled with roasts, sauces, and savory splendor. But the final impression was reserved for something ethereal, peach charlotte russe served in crystal goblets. This wasn't just a dessert. It was a legacy in a glass. The original charlotte dates back to 18th century Europe, where molded desserts were a favorite at royal banquets. But the charlotte russe, a lighter, creamier version, rose to fame in 19th century Paris, before making its way into Gilded Age America. By the 1920s, it had become a fashionable finale at upper-crust gatherings, especially when reimagined with seasonal fruit. At the Vanderbilt Derby Day, the chefs took that tradition and elevated it further. Each crystal goblet was lined with delicate ladyfinger biscuits, standing like tiny columns against the glass. In the center, a chilled mousse of whipped cream, egg custard, and pureed ripe peaches, folded gently to a silky smoothness. The mixture was poured in and left to set until it held just enough structure to stand, yet melted the moment it met the tongue. But it didn't end there. The top was adorned with thin slices of poached peaches, arranged like flower petals, and sometimes finished with a drizzle of peach liqueur or a single candied violet. Served icy cold, the glass would fog slightly, adding to the mystique. This was dessert as performance, a moment where taste met design, and tradition met imagination. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't loud, but it left a lasting impression. Today, charlotte russe is a faded name, mostly forgotten in modern kitchens. But once, it was a symbol of refined indulgence, served only where elegance was the rule. Peach charlotte russe in crystal goblets, a chilled echo from a time when even dessert wore its finest dress. It arrived in silence. No fanfare, no flamboyance, just a delicate shimmer beneath the chandelier light. Lemon blancmange with gold leaf garnish, as if dessert itself had been whispered into existence. In a feast filled with grand roasts and truffled extravagance, this dish stood apart by doing less, and doing it perfectly. Light as air, soft as silk, brightened with lemon, crowned with real gold. Not to overwhelm the palate, but to close the evening on a note of quiet splendor. In 1927, the Vanderbilt Derby Day table was more than a meal. It was a performance, staged with precision and filled with flavors that spoke of status, story, and time. And this blancmange? It was the curtain fall. A final, graceful bow from an era that believed food could be both sustenance and symbol. Today, most of these dishes are forgotten, lost to convenience, pace, and the changing rhythm of how we eat. But their memory lingers, waiting in old menus, family journals, and faded photographs. And now they live again, on our screens, in our kitchens, and maybe on your table. So if these forgotten flavors stirred your curiosity, if you felt the echo of a vanished era in every course we explored, don't let it fade. And most of all, subscribe. Because the table of history is long, and we've only just taken our seat.